He was strapped to the gurney, leather cuffs biting into his wrists and ankles. The needle pierced his skin, cold and unyielding. And then, as the poison surged into his veins, his head snapped up like a man jolted from a nightmare. "It hurts so bad," Byron Black groaned. Not a whisper, but a sharp, raw cry that bounced off the concrete walls and made witnesses flinch. Seconds later, his eyes bulged wide, his chest heaved, and his breath came in panicked bursts. Yet Tennessee's executioners pressed on. Byron Black's death was no quiet drifting into darkness. It was a violent, unsettling spectacle that shattered the calm of the chamber. This is the story of a man put to death in 2025 despite a failing heart. Decades of legal battles and an ending so disturbing that even seasoned witnesses were left shaken. Byron Black was born in 1956 in Nashville, Tennessee, into a small, cramped house on the city's edge where money was always scarce and tension was a daily visitor. His father was largely absent, his mother often overwhelmed, and family meals could be as cold as the winters that crept through their thin walls. Neighbors remembered a thin, quiet boy who spoke softly, kept his eyes low, and spent long hours alone, tinkering with radios or walking the back streets to avoid the fights at home. By his late 20s, years of grinding poverty, bouts of depression, untreated chronic illnesses, and the bitter collapse of a short-lived marriage had pushed him into a dark, downward spiral he could not escape. In 1988, everything changed. On the morning of March 4th that year, alarm bells rang when Black's estranged girlfriend, Angela Clay, failed to appear at her job without so much as a phone call. Hours later, her mother, worried and uneasy, let herself into Angela's small, tidy home and stepped into a scene straight from a nightmare. Angela lay on the floor, lifeless, a dark pool spreading beneath her. Just feet away, her two little girls, LaToya, 9, and Lakeisha, 6, were still in their pajamas, each struck down by bullets from a .22 caliber rifle. The air was heavy with the metallic tang of blood and the eerie stillness of a home where laughter had been replaced by death. Investigators zeroed in on Black almost immediately, not just because of proximity, but because Angela had confided to friends about heated confrontations and threats in the weeks before her death. Neighbors recounted hearing shouting matches and seeing Black loitering outside the home late at night. Detectives learned of a bitter custody and relationship dispute that had escalated into rage. When police searched his residence, they discovered a .22 caliber rifle matching the weapon used in the killings, along with ammunition consistent with the bullets pulled from the victims. At trial, prosecutors painted him as a cold-blooded killer, a man consumed by jealousy and rage who had plotted his attack with chilling precision. They brought in neighbors, police, and forensic experts who described the evidence in excruciating detail. The ballistics matched to his rifle, the residue on his clothing, the timeline that put him at the crime scene minutes before the killings. Family members of the victim sat weeping as the prosecution replayed the horror of that morning. The defense tried to poke holes in the case, raising questions about the investigation and Black's mental health. But it wasn't enough. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours before convicting Byron Black of 3 counts of first-degree murder and sentencing him to death. But the case was far from straightforward. For more than 30 years, Byron Black endured the slow grind of life on Tennessee's death row. The concrete walls of his small cell closed in year after year, the dim hum of fluorescent lights and the distant clang of metal doors marking the passage of time. He watched other inmates leave, some to freedom, most to the execution chamber, while his own health steadily collapsed. Severe heart disease left him short of breath after only a few steps. Diabetes ravaged his body, and multiple strokes stole much of his mobility and left him with slurred speech. By the 2010s, he could barely shuffle to the shower without assistance, relied on a wheelchair for most movement, and depended on a surgically implanted cardiac device to keep his weakened heart beating. Inside prison, he spent his days reading, sketching in worn notebooks, and occasionally speaking with chaplains. But he also faced long stretches of isolation broken only by the muffled sounds of other inmates. Guards described him as frail, polite, and physically harmless. Advocates argued that executing such a man would be both cruel and unconstitutional, a punishment inflicted on someone whose body was already failing. His lawyers insisted he was mentally incompetent to face execution and incapable of harming anyone again. The case wound through appeal after appeal, reaching the Supreme Court, but each plea was rejected. In August 2025, Tennessee set the date for his execution. August 7, 2025, the day of Byron Black's execution. He spent the morning in his cell, the thin pages of a worn Bible rustling in his hands as he read scripture aloud in a low, steady voice, pausing now and then to murmur with his spiritual advisor through the bars. There was no extravagant final feast. He turned down the special last meal, pushing away the offer with a faint shake of his head, settling instead for the plain, lukewarm dinner served to every other inmate. Guards who came to escort him later described him as strangely calm, his eyes distant, as though he'd already stepped out of this world. When the heavy cell door clanged open, he didn't resist. He simply let them wheel his frail frame down the long, echoing corridor toward the death chamber. Strapped to the gurney, IV lines snaked into his arms. His implanted heart device was still active, a point of controversy right until the end. Officials never deactivated it. At 7:14 p.m., the warden's hand dropped, and the room seemed to hold its breath. The hiss of the lethal injection drugs filling the IV line cut through the silence. Within seconds, Black's eyes snapped open wide as if jolted by an unseen force. He gasped sharply, his frail head lifting from the gurney, tendons straining in his neck. "It hurts so bad," he cried out, the words raw, ragged, and echoing off the chamber walls like a final accusation. Witnesses watched in shock as his chest rose and fell in violent spasms, his mouth opening and closing in silent, agonized gasps. His arms twitched against the straps, legs shifting under the restraints. For nearly 40 long seconds, the groans continued, each one fainter than the last, until they dissolved into a still, eerie quiet. At 7:20 p.m., with the chamber heavy in the aftermath, Byron Black was pronounced dead. The execution ignited a wave of outrage. His attorneys called it torture, pointing to his heart condition and the fact that his implanted cardiac device had never been shut off, something they argued could have made the process far more painful. Human rights groups demanded an investigation. Tennessee officials insisted protocol was followed, but for those who sat in that chamber, the image of Byron Black's final moments, the pain in his voice, the way his body jerked against the straps, will never fade. And for the families of Angela, LaToya, and Lakeisha, the debate over cruelty in the execution chamber will never outweigh the cruelty of what happened on March 4th, 1988. What do you think? Was justice served in the case of Byron Black? Or did Tennessee cross a moral line? Subscribe to Death Row Stories for more shocking final hours, infamous last words, and the real stories behind the world's most controversial executions.